Gentlemen, the eastern flank is vulnerable. We must reinforce it. I agree, sir. The 5th Division can be deployed within 24 hours. Agreed. I'll coordinate the air support. Gentlemen, the northern advance is critical. Understood, sir. Logistics are in place. What about flank security? Covered. Proceed.
September of 1945. Frankfurt, Germany. The war in Europe had been over for 4 months. The surrender documents had been signed. The flags had come down from the Reich Chancellery. The German army that had conquered most of a continent and held it for 5 years was gone, dissolved into surrender camps and prisoner columns and the specific, shapeless aftermath that follows the death of something that had once been vast. The men who had fought it were going home. The machinery that had sustained the fight, the convoys and the supply depots and the field hospitals and the forward command posts, was being dismantled with the same systematic energy that had built it. George Smith Patton was not going home. He was sitting in Bad Tölz, Bavaria, in the headquarters of the 3rd United States Army, commanding an occupation zone and attending meetings about denazification policy and displaced persons administration and the restoration of civil governance to a German population that was hungry, exhausted, and in many cases still not entirely sure what it believed about the war it had just lost. These were important tasks. They were necessary tasks. They were tasks that required patience, careful judgment, cultural sensitivity, and a long view of what occupied Germany needed to become. They were not tasks that Patton was suited for, and he knew it.
Gentlemen, the situation is dire. We must execute the plan flawlessly. Understood, sir. Our units are ready. We are in position. The southern flank must be reinforced by dawn. Understood. The terrain is difficult. We have reserves here. Make it so.
And everyone around him knew it, and Eisenhower knew it most of all. Patton had been the instrument of the advance. He had been built through 30 years of professional preparation and 2 years of operational command in the most fluid and violent theater of the Western War for one specific kind of military problem. The problem of finding the gap, driving through it faster than the enemy could respond, and turning a tactical success into an operational collapse before anyone on the other side could organize a coherent defense. He had solved that problem with a consistency and a brilliance that no other commander in the Allied order of battle had matched. The occupation of Germany was a different problem entirely. It required Patton to sit still, which he could not do. It required him to administer rather than advance.
The situation demands immediate action, but we must consider the flanks. Agreed. A misstep here is fatal. Then we move.
Which he found meaningless. It required him to treat the German population as a project of reconstruction rather than a defeated enemy, which he found philosophically confusing. And it required him to manage the denazification program, which required him to apply a policy he disagreed with in a way that was consistent with that policy rather than consistent with his own assessment of it, which was something that George Patton had never in his life been reliably capable of doing. His staff watched him through the summer of 1945 with the specific anxiety of people who understood what was building. He was restless in a way that went beyond personality. He was a man who had organized his entire interior life around the proposition that war was his purpose, and that the skills he had spent decades developing were not just professionally useful, but cosmically significant.
Gentlemen, the objective is clear. There is no margin for error. Execute the plan. Dismissed. Gentlemen, the situation is critical. We move at dawn. Understood, sir. The men are ready. Good. Coordinate with all units.
He had believed, with a sincerity that was neither performance nor delusion, that he had been a soldier in previous lives, that this war was the latest chapter in a story that had been running for centuries, that he was exactly where history required him to be. Now, history had moved on and left him administering a displaced persons program in Bavaria. The press conference he gave in September was the result of all of this, and it was also, though Patton did not fully understand this until it was too late, the end of everything he had built. The press conference was held in Bad Tölz on September 22, 1945. It was a routine event by the standards of occupation administration, the kind of session where a theater commander updated the press corps on the progress of post-war governance and answered questions about policy implementation. Patton did not approach press conferences the way routine events required. He never had. He approached them the way he approached everything, directly, without diplomatic preparation, with the absolute confidence of a man who believed that what he thought was what needed to be said, and that the distinction between what he thought and what he should say publicly was a form of dishonesty he was not prepared to practice. A reporter asked him about the pace of denazification, the Allied policy requiring the removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in German civil administration. The policy was a formal requirement of the occupation governance structure, endorsed by the Allied Control Council and implemented by each occupation zone commander. It was not optional. It was not a matter of individual theater commander discretion. Patton said that the denazification program was being overdone. He said that former Nazi Party members were no more threatening to the occupation's stability than American Democrats or Republicans. He said that the skills of experienced German administrators were being wasted because of their party membership in an organization that was, in his assessment, primarily a political affiliation rather than an ideological commitment. The reporter's pencils started moving. Patton understood at some level what he had done. The accounts of officers who were in the room describe him registering the response of the press corps with something that looked like the specific expression of a man who has just heard a sound he recognizes as the beginning of something irreversible. But he did not retract. He did not clarify. He was not constitutionally equipped to retract or clarify, and in any case, the pencils were already moving, and the calculation had already been made by everyone in the room that this was the story they were filing. The story broke within 24 hours, and the reaction was immediate and severe. In the United States, the Jewish community organizations that had been following the occupation's denazification policy with the specific attention of people who understood precisely what Nazi Party membership had meant for 6 million of their relatives, responded with formal protests to the War Department. Editorial boards that had spent the war celebrating Patton's operational achievements now turned the same energy toward demanding his removal. Political figures who had been building careers on the promise that the defeat of Nazi Germany would be followed by genuine accountability for what the Nazi Party had done, read Patton's remarks and understood that they had been handed an obligation they could not avoid without consequences. In Washington, the War Department received the press reports and the protest letters and the editorial demands simultaneously and began a process of institutional calculation that Patton had triggered many times before, but that had never previously reached its logical conclusion. The process went to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Stimson took it to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. Marshall took it to the one person whose decision would be final. Eisenhower read the reports in his Frankfurt headquarters and felt something that the officers around him later described as a change in the quality of his silence. Not anger exactly, something that had moved past the stage where anger was the operative response. The expression of a man performing a calculation he had been postponing for 2 years and that the arithmetic had finally made unavoidable. He picked up the telephone and placed a call to Bad Tölz. He told Patton to come to Frankfurt. Patton made the drive from Bad Tölz to Frankfurt on September 28, 1945. It was approximately 200 kilometers through the Bavarian countryside and into the American Occupation Zone's administrative center. through landscapes that still showed the war in the form of cleared rubble and repaired bridges, and the specific, tentative quality of a country that was technically at peace but had not yet learned what peace felt like. Patton sat in the back of his staff car and looked at the country that his army had moved through in the final months of the advance and thought about what he was driving toward. He had been through versions of this before. The slapping incidents in Sicily in August of 1943 had produced a meeting with Eisenhower that he had walked into believing his career was over and had walked out of with his command intact, reduced and chastened and placed under conditions, but intact. He had survived that meeting because Eisenhower had calculated that Patton's operational value exceeded the political cost of retaining him, which had been true in the summer of 1943 when the Mediterranean campaign was reaching its decisive phase and no one else in the Allied order of battle could do what Patton did. The calculation in September of 1945 was different in one fundamental respect. The war was over. The thing that had made Patton irreplaceable, his singular genius for armored exploitation, for finding the gap and driving through it faster than anyone could close it, had no application in an occupied Germany at peace. The operational value that had protected him through the slapping incidents, through the press conference disasters, through every episode of spectacular insubordination that had driven Marshall and Eisenhower and Bradley to the edge of relieving him, was gone. What remained was a theater commander who was generating political problems without generating military solutions. Patton understood this better than he was willing to admit to anyone, including himself. His correspondence from the summer of 1945 contains enough careful and qualified statements about his own situation to suggest that somewhere beneath the performance of certainty he had always maintained, he understood what the arithmetic of his position looked like. The war was over. His purpose, as he understood his purpose, had ended with it. What came after was a different kind of problem for a different kind of man, and he was not that kind of man. He arrived in Frankfurt in the early afternoon. Eisenhower's headquarters was in the IG Farben building, a massive pre-war corporate complex that the Occupation Administration had converted into the supreme headquarters of American forces in Europe. It was an impressive building in the specific way that buildings built to project institutional authority are impressive, which was not a quality Patton associated with anything he valued. He went in. He was shown to Eisenhower's office. He went through the door and saw Ike behind the desk and understood from Eisenhower's expression that this was not the meeting he had survived before. The accounts of the Frankfurt meeting come from several sources, none of them complete and none of them identical. What happened in Eisenhower's office on September 28th was not recorded by a stenographer and was not reconstructed in any official document. What exists is a set of partial accounts from Patton's aide, Charles Codman, from Eisenhower's aide, Harry Butcher, from the recollections of officers in the outer office who heard fragments of what occurred inside, and from the letters and diary entries that both men wrote in the days immediately following. From these sources, a picture emerges that is consistent enough in its essential shape to be treated as reliable. Eisenhower did not begin with recriminations. That was not his method, and it was not how he had managed Patton through 2 years of productive and exhausting command. He began by laying out the situation as he understood it, which was the approach of a man who wanted the person across the desk to understand that the decision being communicated had been reached by a process of clear reasoning rather than personal animus. The press conference remarks had created a political problem that had moved beyond Eisenhower's ability to manage through the methods he had used before. The previous episodes, the slapping incidents, the Pearl Harbor speech that had been used to exclude Patton from early planning for Overlord, the off-the-record remarks that had reached the press at inconvenient moments throughout the campaign, had all been manageable because the operational situation had given Eisenhower the argument he needed to make to the people demanding Patton's removal. The argument was, he is winning battles that no one else can win, and the cost of removing him now is greater than the cost of retaining him. That argument was gone. There were no more battles. The operational ledger that had protected Patton was closed, and what was left was a political ledger that had been accumulating entries since Sicily, and that the Frankfurt press conference had pushed past the point of management. Eisenhower told Patton that he was being relieved of command of Third Army. The accounts differ on what Patton said in response. Codman's recollection suggests that Patton was quieter than anyone who knew him would have predicted, that the theatrical machinery of his personality, the posture and the voice, and the carefully maintained performance of absolute certainty was not fully engaged in the way it was in situations where he believed the outcome was still contestable. He made arguments. He challenged the fairness of the decision. He pointed to his record. He said things that Eisenhower listened to with the patient attention of a man who had already made his decision and was allowing the process of delivering it to take the time it required. Eisenhower did not change the decision. What he offered instead was something that had the form of an alternative and the substance of a conclusion. Patton would be relieved of Third Army. He would be given command of the 15th Army, a paper formation whose primary function was to produce a historical study of the European campaign. It was work that required a general officer of sufficient seniority to lend it institutional authority. It was not combat command. It was not operational authority. It was the assignment of a man being moved to a position where he could do no further damage while the institution figured out what to do with him. Patton understood exactly what was being offered. He was not a naive man, and he had spent 30 years in an institution whose mechanisms for managing difficult officers he understood thoroughly. The 15th Army assignment was not a next chapter, it was a waiting room. The question was what he was waiting for. And the answer, which neither man stated directly, because stating it directly would have required a different kind of conversation than either of them was prepared to have, was that he was waiting for the process of his separation from the Army to be managed in a way that protected the institution and preserved his legacy, without requiring the kind of formal relief that would define how history remembered him. Patton accepted the assignment. He walked out of Eisenhower's office and got back into his staff car and was driven back toward the headquarters where he would begin the process of handing over Third Army to his successor. The officers in the outer office, who had heard the raised voices and then the silence and then Patton's footsteps in the corridor, watched him pass without speaking. His expression, in the accounts of the men who saw him that afternoon, was the one thing about the meeting that every account describes consistently. He looked like a man who had just been told something he had known was coming and had not, until the moment it arrived, fully believed. The decision Eisenhower communicated in Frankfurt on September 28th had not been made on September 28th. It had been building since Tunisia in 1943, through Sicily, through the planning for Overlord, through the breakout from Normandy, through the Bulge, through the Rhine crossing, and through the summer of 1945, accumulating with each episode and each managed crisis until the Frankfurt press conference provided the occasion that the accumulation had been waiting for. Eisenhower had known for most of 2 years that this day was coming. What he had been doing in the interval was managing the timing of it so that it arrived when the cost to the war effort was lowest and the cost to Patton's legacy was manageable. The slapping incidents in Sicily had been the first moment when the decision had become real rather than theoretical. Eisenhower had received the formal medical reports, understood the institutional and political exposure they created, and performed a calculation that he documented in a letter to Marshall in August of 1943. The calculation was explicit. Patton's retention was justified by his operational value. His removal at that moment, with the Italian campaign beginning and no comparable commander available to replace him, would cost more than his retention. The decision to retain him was not a judgment that the slapping was acceptable. It was a judgment that the alternative was worse. Marshall had accepted the calculation. He had accepted it with the specific reluctance of a man who understood that accepting it set a precedent, and that precedents in the management of difficult officers had a way of compounding over time. He had told Eisenhower, in the correspondence that followed, that the calculation was correct for the current moment, and that it needed to be revisited at each subsequent moment, because the variables that made it correct were not permanent. Eisenhower had revisited it. He had revisited it through the planning for Overlord, when Patton's exclusion from the initial command structure had been managed by using him as the centerpiece of the deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais. He had revisited it through the summer of 1944, when Third Army's performance in the breakout and the advance across France had generated the operational results that justified Patton's retention and simultaneously generated the press coverage and the political complications that required Eisenhower's constant management. He had revisited it through the Bulge, when Patton's relief of Bastogne had produced the most celebrated moment of his career, and temporarily silenced the voices in Washington that had been arguing for his removal since the slapping incidents. Each time Eisenhower had revisited the calculation, the answer had been the same: retain. The operational value exceeds the political cost. The war requires what Patton can do. The damage he causes can be managed. In September of 1945, for the first time since Tunisia, the calculation produced a different answer. The operational value was zero. The war was over. The damage from the Frankfurt press conference was not manageable through the methods Eisenhower had used before, because those methods depended on the argument that the damage was worth tolerating in exchange for operational results, and there were no more operational results to be produced. The political pressure from Washington was not the kind that could be deflected by pointing to a map and showing what Third Army had done last month, because there was no last month. There was only the press conference and the protests and the editorial demands, and a War Department that had been protecting Patton's command for 2 years on Eisenhower's assurance that it was worth protecting, and that was no longer in a position to make that assurance credible. Eisenhower called Marshall before he called Patton to Frankfurt. The conversation was brief in the way that conversations between men who have been building toward a decision for 2 years are brief when the decision finally arrives. Marshall asked Eisenhower what he intended to do. Eisenhower told him. Marshall said he concurred. Neither man said anything about what the decision cost or what it meant for the man it was being applied to, because that was not the kind of conversation Marshall and Eisenhower had. They had operational conversations. They communicated through the language of decisions and their justifications. The human content of those decisions was carried in the silences between the words, and both men understood it was there without requiring it to be stated. The call to Bad Tolz came after the call to Marshall. George Patton took command of the 15th Army on October 7, 1945. He moved from Bad Tolz to the 15th Army's headquarters and began the work of organizing the historical study that was the formation's primary purpose. He attended the required meetings and signed the required documents and performed the functions of a theater commander with the professional discipline that had always been the foundation beneath the performance. the part of Patton that existed independent of the speeches and the uniform and the ivory-handled revolvers. He also wrote letters. The letters from October and November of 1945 are among the most revealing documents he left, because they were written by a man who understood his situation with a clarity that the performance of his public persona had often obscured. He wrote to his wife Beatrice about the 15th Army assignment in terms that made no pretense about what it was. He wrote about the war in terms that made clear he understood it was over in every sense that mattered to him. He wrote about the future in terms that were notably absent of the absolute certainty about destiny and purpose that had characterized his correspondence through the years of the advance. He was 60 years old. He had been at war in various forms since 1916. His body, which had carried him through 2 world wars, a cavalry charge in Mexico, a road accident in England that had cracked his ribs in 1944, and the accumulated physical punishment of decades of aggressive physical activity, was sending him messages that he had been ignoring for months. The people who spent time with him in October and November of 1945 describe a man who was tired in a way that went past physical fatigue into something that had no clean military term. On December 8, 1945, Patton and his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, drove out of Mannheim to spend the day hunting in the countryside. On the return journey, on a road outside the city, a United States Army truck made an unexpected turn and struck the staff car. The other passengers were shaken but uninjured. Patton was not wearing his seatbelt, which was consistent with his lifelong attitude toward personal safety, and the impact drove him forward into the front compartment with enough force to break his neck at the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was taken to the military hospital in Heidelberg, where the physicians who examined him told the officers waiting in the corridors outside his room the same thing in different language. The injury was of the kind that did not heal. The paralysis was permanent. The man who had commanded an army across 700 miles of European territory would not walk out of the Heidelberg hospital. He died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident. He had never returned to the United States. He had spent his final weeks in a hospital in Germany, in the country his army had defeated, in the theater where he had done the work that history would remember him for. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army, which was the only place he could reasonably have been buried. Eisenhower was in Washington when Patton died. His response, in the official statement he released and in the private correspondence of the following days, was that of a man managing grief through institutional language, because institutional language was what he had available for the purpose. He praised Patton's operational achievements. He expressed the loss to the Army and to the nation. He said the things that needed to be said, and said them in the measured, careful cadence of a man who had spent 2 years managing the most difficult professional relationship of his career, and who was now managing its conclusion. What he did not say publicly, and what the record suggests he carried privately through the years of his post-war career and his presidency and his own retirement, was more complicated. Eisenhower had protected Patton when protection was possible, and had ended his command when it was not, and he had done both of these things with the cold operational clarity of a supreme commander making resource allocation decisions. He had never confused the friendship between them, which was real and which had survived everything the war had put between them, with the professional calculation that the command of an alliance required. But the friendship had been real. The letters between them and the accounts of their interactions through the years of the war contain enough evidence of genuine mutual respect and genuine mutual affection to make clear that the relationship was not simply professional. These were men who had been through something together that could not be explained to anyone who had not been there, and the weight of that shared experience was present in every difficult conversation they had, including the one in Frankfurt. The career Eisenhower ended in Frankfurt was not the career of a stranger. It was the career of a man he had known since West Point, had served beside in the peacetime army, had brought to North Africa, had protected through Sicily, had deployed to France, had watched produce the most extraordinary armored advance in the history of modern warfare. Ending it was not a failure of that relationship. It was an expression of everything the relationship had always been, a professional partnership conducted between men who understood that professional partnerships had requirements that personal loyalties could not override. Eisenhower had always known that. Patton had always known it too. The meeting in Frankfurt was the moment the knowing became the thing itself. The secret of that meeting was not in what was said, it was in what both men already understood before Patton walked through the door. The decision had been building for 2 years in the arithmetic of the alliance, in the operational record, in the political ledger that every press conference and every insubordinate speech and every incident of the slapping kind had been adding to since Tunisia. Eisenhower had not been waiting for the right moment to end Patton's career. He had been managing the cost of not ending it until the cost of not ending it exceeded the cost of ending it. In September of 1945, the war gone and the political damage compounding without any operational justification remaining to balance it, the arithmetic was final. The greatest American field commander of the Second World War was relieved not because he had failed. He was relieved because the war he had been built for was over, and what came after required qualities that were not his, and the institution that had built him and used him and protected him through 4 years of extraordinary and frequently maddening service had one final obligation to perform. It performed it in Frankfurt on September 28, 1945, in a meeting that lasted less than an hour and that changed nothing about the operational record and everything about what came next. Patton drove back to Bad Tölz in the staff car. Eisenhower went back to the work of managing a post-war world that was already generating the next set of problems. Both men understood what had passed between them. Neither would fully speak of it. Some decisions between soldiers are too large for the words that would be required to hold them. They are carried instead in silence for whatever time remains.